Okay. You could be turning in your Bibles, your devices, your handhelds to Esther chapter 7. And I think what we're going to do each class before we get into the new section is we'll have a recap of what we've studied so far leading up to this point. So, what do we know about King Xerxes? Wealthy. Okay, so King Xerxes was extremely wealthy. He was king over 127 different provinces. And you may remember at the very beginning of the book of Esther in chapter 1, he throws a banquet. Do you remember how many days that banquet lasted? Banquet lasted 7 days. And it said that during that banquet he showed the extreme wealth that the king and the countries had. What do we know about Queen Vashti?
She got in trouble.
Okay, Queen Vashti got in trouble. How'd she get in trouble? Anyone remember? So the king had asked Vashti to come to him. And it sort of implies that maybe it was during the banquet. I didn't know if he wanted to show off her great beauty or wanted to show her off to everyone that was there at the banquet. But what did Vashti say? Anyone remember?
She wouldn't come.
I'm not coming. So here's the king asking the queen to come, and she decides she's not to. So he pulls together all his advisors and the people that he had confidence in when it came time to make a decision. So what did the advisors recommend to the King Xerxes that he should do about Queen Vashti not showing up?
She needs to be her throne taken away from her because, because they want the other women to follow her.
That's right. Queen Vashti was acting pretty uppity. And so the advisor said, you better do something about this. I'd throw her out as queen because word's going to get out and all the other wives are going to start treating the husbands the exact same way. So Queen Vashti is sent out. I'm sorry?
I'm making a smart remark.
Queen Vashti is thrown out. So sort of parallel to this, what's the relationship with Mordecai and Esther?
Cousins.
They're cousins. And Mordecai must have been an older cousin. There's some references that even refer to him as an uncle, but certainly in the book of Esther it says that Mordecai is Esther's cousin, and we don't know for sure why Esther doesn't have parents to take care of her, but for whatever reason, she's by herself, and Mordecai decides that he would raise his cousin Esther. What do we know about Esther's beauty and personality? You know anything? She was very beautiful. And so the king's going to have a new queen. So they gather up all the potential candidates for queen together, and Esther's selected as one of the candidates. And in fact, she goes through 12 months of beauty treatments before she's presented to the king. And the king finds favor with Esther, and she becomes queen, and he throws a big banquet in honor of Esther. So now this is the second banquet of the book of Esther, the one when Esther becomes queen, and it's the first one that she's involved with. Where did Mordecai, where did he take place in the city? Where was his place during the day where he would hang out? At the king's gates. And we don't know for sure what he's doing at the gates, but it could be a place where he's conducting business, where he's conducting some type of commerce. While Mordecai's at the gate, what does he catch wind of? Anyone remember?
Kill the king.
Okay, conspiracy to kill the king. So two of the people that are in the king's inner circle are starting to plot to kill the king. Which, if you remember the background that we were given by Don and Anita, this whole Persian Empire, over a period of time, there was a lot of killing, assassinations to be able to take over the king's throne. You may remember there was one case where one of the kings had killed 80 of his family members so that there would be no doubt who was going to be king. So Mordecai hears this, and he gets the word to the king via who?
Esther.
Okay, so he lets Esther know. Esther gets word to the king, and the two conspiring against the king to kill him are put to death. And Esther makes sure to give credit to Mordecai for uncovering the plot. What do we know about Haman?
He was the king's right-hand man.
Okay, so Haman was sort of second in command, given a lot of authority. What was his national background? What line of folks did he? He was an Amalekite. And what do we know about the Amalekite and the Jews? They did not like each other. In fact, as the children of Israel were leaving Egypt, after they had left Egypt, one of the groups of people that they fought was the Amalekites. Saul was king then, and the Lord told Saul to destroy everything, annihilate all the people, kill all the cattle, the whole bit. And do you remember what Saul did? Didn't kill the king, and he took some of the cattle and animals. So this hatred back and forth goes back multiple generations, and the only reason there's a Haman today is Saul didn't kill king of the Amalekites at the time. Okay, so Haman is promoted. He's the right-hand man. He's the number 2 person. When he goes through the cities, goes through the streets, what does he expect everyone to do?
Bow down.
Bow down. And who won't bow down? Mordecai. And what does Haman think about that?
He hates it.
He hates it. I mean,
It's a sign of disrespect, and that everybody else is going to lose respect for him.
absolutely right. So we don't know for sure why Mordecai won't bow down. It could be the hatred for the Amalekites in general and for Haman. We don't hear that other Israelites won't bow down, but certainly Mordecai will not. So when Mordecai's all upset, he goes belly aching to his wife and friends, and what's their solution? Okay, so they're going to build this pole 75 foot in the air, have like a spear on the end of it, and they're going to impale Haman on the top. Esther, in many versions, referred to it as gallows, but it wasn't the kind where you're going to be hung. You're going to be impaled and put on top of the pole. So, how do they decide when this? Let me go ahead and go forward. So, in addition, what's Haman decide to do to all the Jews?
Kill them all.
Okay, so he just wants to go ahead and kill all the Jews. Does he have the authority to do that? No. So he goes to King Xerxes and says, there's these people out there that are disobeying the king's laws, which was an outright lie. And he doesn't say it's the Israelites. He says there's this people out there. And he paints this terrible picture. And he wants to kill all the Jews. Doesn't use the word Jews. He wants to kill those people that are disobeying. What's the king say? Have at it. In fact, he gives him his ring where he can put the seal on the decree to give the authority for the people. He doesn't know it at the time, but the Jews to be killed. So how does Haman determine when the decree will be executed? How does he determine when that's going to happen? It's the roll of the dice. So it's casting lots, and one of the words equivalent to casting lots is pur, P-U-R. So they throw purs. It could have been stones, it could have been sticks, but they throw those to determine when the death of the Jews is going to take place. And it's the 13th day of the month of Adar. And in our modern day calendar, it falls somewhere during February and March. Now, why is it not an exact date? Why is it a range of dates in February to March?
Because their calendar was based off the sighting of the new Jews.
Because their calendar was based off moon. It was a lunar calendar. So how many days in a lunar calendar, how many days in a month? So it's 29 and a half. So 29 and a half days are in the lunar calendar. Our modern day calendar is based on what? So, but how is a year determined in the current calendar? In general, it's 30, 31 days in the month. How do we do it today? So we do it based on how long it takes the Earth to circle the sun, as opposed to the moon circling the Earth. So at this time, the lunar calendar, the calendar based on the moon, was 29 and a half days. Our modern calendar is 365.25 days.
Wait, are you throwing some numbers in there we didn't see?
Hey, you're testing us on things we're not
Wait,
We're not prepared for that.
No, you didn't tell us.
And it's free. I won't charge you extra for that.
Remember, she's going home with you.
So that's why the calendar doesn't line up exactly. It's the same reason why Easter varies. Sometime in March or sometime in April. Is the Jewish Passover was based on the moon calendar, the lunar calendar, and ours is based on the sun. That was extra. So word gets out that Haman's going to have all the Jews killed, and what does Mordecai do? Tells Esther, he says, we need some help. We are in trouble. And does Esther think it's a good idea to help right away? No. She doesn't think this is a good idea, so Mordecai continues to work on her, and she says, okay, I'll help, because she'll have to go before the king. You can't go before the king unless the king summons you. And so Esther says, you know, I'll go before the king, and she says, if I perish, I perish. So if you went before the king and the king wasn't pleased that you showed up, you could be put to death. So Mordecai begins to mourn. It says, all the Jews are fasting and weeping in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther decides, today's the day I'm going to go try to get the king's attention. So what does she do?
Dresses up.
She dresses up in her queen's attire, and she goes hanging out in the outer courtyard. And King Xerxes spots her out in the courtyard, and what's he do? Come on in. So Esther comes in, and the king asks her, what is it that you want? And she says, I would love to throw a banquet for you, for me, and for Haman. So they have the banquet, and this is now the third banquet that's listed in the book of Esther, the second one that Esther personally has participated in. So they have the banquet. The king says, Esther, what do you want? And what does she say she wants at the first banquet that she requested? I want to have a second banquet.
Yeah.
And I want the second banquet to be tomorrow. And I want it again to be me, you, and Haman. So then Haman's rage against Mordecai increases even more, and the pole is built, and we're all ready for Haman to grab Mordecai and impale him. So up to this point, everything that's happening as a result of Haman being second in charge, things really couldn't be more bleak for the Jews or for Mordecai. So that's sort of the pinnacle of the book for the things that are going to happen to Mordecai or happen to the Jews that are negative. And now we're going to start having the turning point in the book. So last week we talked about Xerxes not being able to sleep. So he calls some of his people in, and what's he asked them to do? Read out of the Chronicles, read out of the history book what's happened here lately. And they go back 5 years, and they start reading to Xerxes about Mordecai and Mordecai's uncovering the plot to kill him, and that the potential assassins wind up being killed. And Mordecai decides that, King Xerxes decides that King Xerxes decides that Mordecai should be honored in some way. So Haman's hanging out in the foyer, out in the courtyard, and in his mind, Haman's going to try to get permission from the king to kill Mordecai. So just as he got permission from the king to make the edict about 11 months out for the Jews to be killed, he's out there hanging out asking, getting ready to ask Xerxes, can I kill Mordecai? Got the pole built, the whole bit. So the king sees Haman out there, and he has him come in, meet with the king. And what's the king ask Haman?
What should you do to honor it?
If I was going to honor somebody, what should I do? And what's Haman's initial thoughts?
It's going to be him.
If the king wants to honor anybody, surely it's got to be me. So he talks about having the king honor this person who he thinks will be himself with his royal robe, get to wear the royal robe, get to go on the king's horse, and be paraded throughout the city to see how the king's honoring this person. What's the king think of that idea? He said, that sounds great. And so, what's the next words out of the king's mouth? Go do that for Mordecai. Could you imagine the look on Haman's face? So Haman goes in to try to get permission from the king to allow him to kill Mordecai, and now he's got to parade Mordecai through the streets. And the king says, do it exactly in the manner that you've described. So that brings us up to chapter 7. So would someone be willing to read Esther chapter 7, the first 2 verses, verses 1 and 2?
I'll read it.
Okay.
Now this is a little bit different translation, but so the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom.
So last week, as chapter 6 ended, Haman had just taken Mordecai throughout the city. He goes running back home to his wife and friends. He's even got a covering over his head. He's so ashamed of what he had to do for Mordecai. And you may remember while they were there, the king's people came and scooped up Haman to make sure he gets to the banquet on time. So, Haman's probably sitting there saying, this has sort of been a rough day so far, right? But at least I'm still here with the king and the queen, and it's just us. I'm here at the banquet. And what's it say they were doing just before the king asked Queen Esther what she wanted? What does it say that they were doing? Okay, they're at the banquet, and they're literally doing what? Drinking wine. So don't know for sure how much wine the king had to drink, but for whatever reason, it was important enough to put it in there that they're drinking wine, and the king says, Queen Esther, tell me what it is that you want. What is your petition up to half the kingdom, and it will be granted? Now, when have we heard this up to half the kingdom before? Do you remember? Go back to Esther chapter 5 and verse 3. So when Queen Esther first approached the king, he says, sure, tell me what you want. You can have up to half my kingdom. And then that's when she said, I wanted the banquet. So now we're in the second banquet, and the king asks the same thing. Do you remember that happening in the New Testament at the time when the king offered up to half his kingdom? Let's turn to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, verses 21 through 28. Anyone okay with reading that? Mark chapter 6, 21 through 28. Okay, Bob.
Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet with his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of the Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod with his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you. And he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask her? The head of John the Baptist, she answered. But once the girl hurried into the king with the request, I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on the platter. The king was greatly distressed because of his oaths of his dinner guests. He did not want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So there's at least two recordings in the Bible about the king being at a banquet. I'm guessing in both cases wine was involved. Offered to the person to make a request up to half my kingdom. In history, we're told that the Roman Emperor Constantine granted dominion over the Western Roman Empire to Pope Sylvester I. So we have at least one example in history of possibly up to half the kingdom being awarded. So it appears as though it's not just a false promise. It's, I'm willing to give you what you asked for up to half my kingdom. Okay, how about Esther chapter 7, verses 3 and 4?
Then Queen Esther said, if I have a favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me my petition and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, slain, and wiped out of existence. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I would have held my tongue. For our affliction is not to be compared with the damage this will do to the king.
Okay, so the first thing, thank you, Teresa. The first thing Esther says is, if I have found favor with you, or I found favor in your sight. If you look back, and we won't read these, but if you look back to Esther 2 and verse 9, when they were trying to determine who should be potential candidates for the queen, it said that Esther found favor with that selection process. Then and again in Esther 2:15, as she's going through the beauty treatments, they said Esther found favor with all that she came in contact with. And then in Esther 2:17, it says that Esther found favor with the king, and he wound up selecting her for queen. So Esther says, if I have found favor with you. Now, hopefully, she thought the cards were stacked in her favor by saying that. But if I found favor with you, my petition is to grant my life. My request is to grant the life of my people. So, I'm sure King Xerxes is thinking, where is this coming from? Why do you want me to save your life, and why do you want me to save the life of your people? And it's very interesting the words that Esther uses. She goes, I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. Now, why would she say Esther herself and her people have been sold? Why would she say that? Does anyone remember? So when Haman went to the king and said, getting permission to have all these people slain that were disobeying his laws, he offered to put 10,000 talents into the treasury if the king would grant this. And that's approximately 2/3 of a laborer's wage at the time. How about the words destruction, slaughter, and annihilation? So in Esther 4:7, the decree that Haman put out said that that's what I want to happen to the Jews. He wants destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. So Esther in front of Haman is using the exact words that was in the decree that went out on what was supposed to happen to the Jewish people. Interestingly, when God told Saul to kill the Amalekites, those were the 3 exact words that God had used to Saul when he wanted the Amalekites. He wanted them to be destroyed, slaughtered, and annihilated. So going all the way back to the beginning of the conflict between the Amalekites and the Jews, that's what God's words were. So what do you think Haman's thinking? Uh-oh. Absolutely.
This is not going to look good.
No, and you know, since he wrote the decree, he offered to put the money into the treasury. He's understanding that Esther's using his exact words. So, you know, when Haman went to the banquet, he says, you know, it's been a bad day. I had to, you know, honor Mordecai in the streets, but at least I'm here at the banquets. At the banquet, it isn't, you know, very far into the banquet that things look much worse for Haman. How does Esther end her request?
She said that if we'd been merely sold as slaves, that she could remain quiet.
So,
in other words, it wouldn't have been as big a deal, right?
that's right. So I don't know if women are born with this natural ability or they learn it from mom, or, you know, when you guys have your slumber parties, you talk about it. But you know how to work the guys, and you especially know how to work your husbands, right? So can't you picture Esther? You know, King, if all we were is being sold into slavery, if all we were going to be as slaves, I wouldn't even bother you with this request. But since they're talking about killing us, I'm coming with the request. So she sort of ends it where she's trying to continue to work the king. Okay. How about verses 5 through 7?
King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, the vile Haman." The Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life.
Okay. So, thank you, Mike. Esther says that the adversary, the enemy, the person who is doing this, after the king says, you know, who, right? Who? Where is this guy? Who would possibly do something like this? Now, just before Esther answers, you know Haman's got to be shaking in his boots, right? I mean, he's got to be shaking in his boots. So, she says it's the adversary, the enemy, this vile, and I'm sure she put emphasis on vile. This vile Haman is the one that has plotted to do this. Now, she called him vile Haman. Do you remember from last week what Haman had called Mordecai? Remember how he referred to Mordecai when he went belly aching to his wife and friends, how they referred to Mordecai? It was that Jew. So we've gone from Mordecai, that Jew, to the vile Haman. So Esther just sort of lays all the cards on the table and says it just like it is. So it says Haman is terrified. And if you think about it, we sort of got to the midpoint of the book, and everything up to that point, it was bad for Mordecai, it was bad for the Jews, and Haman is in control, right? He was second in command to Xerxes' kingdom. He had arranged for the Jews to be killed. He had arranged for Mordecai to be impaled. He thought Xerxes wanted to honor him. And he was going to go to 2 banquets with just the king and the queen. So he goes from sort of being in control on top of the world to now he's called out by Esther in front of the king. So what's the king do?
He left his wine, I know that.
Okay, so he left his wine. Where did he go?
Out of the palace garden.
Okay, so what do you think caused the king to head out there?
Probably to cool off.
Okay, cool off. He is upset. It says he's in a rage. He's about as upset as he can be. So, as you said, he probably went out into the garden to cool off. Try to get his thoughts together, try to cool down a little bit, and think, what am I going to do now? So the person that you trusted more than anybody else in your kingdom, the person that you had made second in command, has sort of tricked the king, because when he said these people weren't obeying his laws, he never said it was the Jews. He just said it was the people. So it was a lie to begin with, and then secondly, he didn't really say who it was. And so, you know, all of this is sort of thrown on the king all at once, right? I mean, Esther sort of set the table, literally. So she had the request. The request was the first banquet. The king has anticipated this first banquet. They have the banquet. He says, what's your request? Well, I'd like to have another banquet tomorrow. So, you know, the king in the back of his mind's got to be wondering, what is it that the queen wants? And so she really had him set up, and indicates that Haman is wanting to kill her and kill her people. So, what's it say went through Haman's mind? He's pretty much sure that he knows what the king's going to do, right? And it's probably going to be kill him. So it says in verse 7, the king got up in a rage, left his wine, went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, which was probably going to be death, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. So, couldn't be much worse for Haman. You know, he was the man, right? He didn't want to sit down and talk to Mordecai. Hey, you know, why are you not bowing down before me? You know, what can we do to work this out? He didn't want to, you know, have a discussion with the Jewish people. I'm really upset with y'all. What can we do? No, he just decides he's going to go ahead and kill everybody. So he's now begging Queen Esther for his life. So he stays behind. Okay. How about verses 8 through 10?
Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided.
So, you know, last week I mentioned this is like a mini-series. I mean, if you did this today with the president and the vice president and the president's first lady, I mean, it couldn't be much more of a story than what it is here. So, the king's out in the garden. He decides he's cooled off enough to come back in. Mordecai is begging Esther. Now, in this time period, when you were having a meal, were you sitting at a table in chairs like this? No. You reclined. Maybe there was a mat on the floor, or in this case, since it was the king and queen, they were reclined on a couch when they had the banquet. So apparently the king goes out into the garden. Esther's still reclining on her couch. One of those, and it probably looked like one of those fainting couches. You know what I'm talking about? Vic knows, she's got one in her bedroom.
Chase?
A chase? Yes, that's exactly right. So Esther is there on her fainting couch, and Haman is begging with her. And what position does Haman take? He falls down on the couch beside her to beg. So the king walks in, And Haman's laying there on the couch next to the queen, and Haman's thinking, ruh-roh, I am in so much trouble. Now, do you remember another story in the Old Testament where there was a story about a woman reclining on the couch and someone else getting in trouble as a result of it? Do you remember anything else in the Old Testament? Remember the story of Joseph? So Joseph was, a pretty good-looking guy. Probably, would have qualified for the Chippendales today. And the queen, Pharaoh's wife, kept hitting on him. And Joseph kept saying, no, I can't do this before the Lord. The Pharaoh has given me all this power. I couldn't do this to the Pharaoh. And she keeps hitting on him. So at some point, she's on her couch, and Joseph's in the room, and she grabs Joseph and is pulling him down on the couch. And what happens? No, the king didn't walk in this case. Does anyone remember? Joseph runs. And when he runs, she grabs his coat, and the coat's laying there. And Joseph's running out without his coat. So the queen tells her servants, look here, Joseph tried to molest me, and, I scared him off and he ran away. And you may remember there was a couple other references to the story of Joseph last week. Mordecai gets his break when the king can't sleep and he has the history books read. Joseph got his break when the Pharaoh had his dreams that couldn't be interpreted. And Joseph interprets the dreams for the Pharaoh. So we've got another case here. In both cases, being on the couch with the queen wasn't a negative act. It wasn't as much as we don't like Haman, he wasn't trying to molest the queen. Joseph certainly wasn't trying to molest the queen. But when the king comes in from the garden, it's not looking good with Haman laying there on the couch with the queen. And the king exclaims, will he even molest the queen while she's still with me in the house? So more than likely, whatever time he spent in the garden and cooled off, when he got back in, it probably got ratcheted up to where it was before, or maybe even a little higher. So as soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So apparently he's going to be drug out, and I guess even in executions in the early part of the United States, often they put a covering over the person's head if they were going to hang him, or some type of execution. They often put a covering over the face when that execution was going to take place. Do you remember the last time that Haman's face had been covered? So after he paraded Mordecai through the streets, he was so embarrassed that he covered his face when he returned home, and before he went before his wife and friends, he had covered his face. So just as we think things couldn't even get worse for Haman, what does Harbana, one of the king's eunuchs, what does he say?
He said that Haman had set up a sharpened pole that spans 75 feet or 50 cubits tall in his own courtyard.
Okay.
And he intended to use that to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination.
Okay, so now there's going to be another charge against Haman. Not only is the pole there waiting, don't even have to set it up, he intended to use that on the person who saved the king's life. And there's certainly loyalty from a king to people that are loyal servants, especially someone that would keep him from being assassinated. So now there's a second charge against Haman, his attempt to kill the king's benefactor. So the king's had enough. What's he say? Kill him. Put him on the pole and kill him. So they impale Haman, and he is taken care of. And what's it say, the very last sentence of chapter 7?
The king's fury subsides.
Okay, so the king's fury subsided. Was there any other reference to the king's fury in Esther so far? Do you remember? If we go back to Esther chapter 2, verse 1. Later, when the anger of the king Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. So, apparently the king had the ability to get angry, to get upset, and it said finally when Haman was impaled that his fury has subsided. So Haman's gone. Is everything good now? Yes? No?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So Charles thinks yes. Anyone think no? Okay.
We're still going to be annihilated.
Okay. So the Jews are still going to be annihilated. And
Because the decree wasn't overturned or whatever, right?
that's exactly right. So next week in chapter 8, we'll go to the next step where part of the problem's been solved. Haman's dead now, but what is the ability just to ignore the decree? Can't if it's been decreed by the king, if the signet ring's been on it, you can't ignore it. So next week we're going to find out how we're going to get around this decree that the king had ordered unknowingly through Haman to have all the Jews killed. So it's still not good. It's still not all good. We're through Haman, but the Jews still are set up to be destroyed, annihilated, and slaughtered. Any additional comments? Anything that anyone would like to mention? Okay, we're about 5 minutes early, but I appreciate y'all being here this morning. Thank you.
Yeah.